Ciao a tutti, benvenuti al tavolo italiano, and to the video series Tips on Learning Italian. This is our 7th installment on Tips on Learning Italian, and to recap where we've been so far, our first installment was of course the introduction. Then we talked about the first mistake. We talked about being realistic, defining what you want to do, sources for study material, and then in our last installment we talked about support elements. In this installment we're going to start getting into the nuts and bolts. We're going to talk about tips for vocabulary, learning vocabulary. I'm actually pretty excited about this lesson because we've spent 5 videos so far, the 5 after the introduction, laying the foundation for building an environment, attitudes, and a mindset for learning and studying Italian. An atmosphere and a beginning that leads to a successful endeavor. This video is where we start to get into the nuts and bolts, which is actually my favorite topics. Vocabulary is important for obvious reasons. The most obvious being the more vocabulary you know, the more things you can talk about. But where do you start? I mean, there's an entire world of a language to learn. Sure, there's the obvious hi, how are you, etc., which are a great, very, very beginning. But where do you go from there? Well, now keep in mind, while listening to this particular installment or lesson, you need to be keeping in mind where your goals and objectives are, okay? So apply what you hear here to what it is that you want to accomplish. So first of all, if you're following some sort of a structured course, the first thing that naturally I would recommend you do, and highly recommend, is learn the vocabulary that's set forth in that course at that time. Because more than likely there's a reason why that vocabulary is there at that point in time in that course. You're going to be building on it, so you want to make sure you get that down. But what about if you want to learn other vocabulary? What about if you're doing really well, or you're taking the course at a slow enough pace where you can add vocabulary, where you want to learn some more words? How do you decide what vocabulary that you want to add? Well, actually, it's pretty easy. The easiest way to determine that is what I call try saying it in Italian. And what I mean by that is what you're thinking in English, try to vocalize it. And first of all, let's think about this. What do you think you're going to talk about in Italian? Okay, especially when you're in Italy. Well, first of all, you're going to want to be able to greet people, ask them how they are, and understand. Okay? And then another universal set of vocabulary that I would encourage people to learn is things like directions. How do you get to and fro? And once again, learning enough vocabulary so that you can understand the answers that they're going to give you to that question. I remember the first time that I really tried to use my Italian in Italy. I was going somewhere, it was possibly maybe 3/4 of a mile to a mile walk. And I actually had to stop and ask directions 3 times in Italian. I refused to go to English. But it took me 3 times to really narrow down what it was they were telling me, and eventually I got there. So make sure you include words like steps, because you're going to find a lot of those in most places in Italy. But then, what about after that? Well, obviously you're going to want to be able to order dinner, make reservations, possibly a few words for motels. Now granted, at a lot of these places, in tourist areas in particular, they're going to be able to speak English, but if you want to speak Italian, then I would learn that. Also, if you think you may be going to Italy and you're going to travel to places that aren't quite as touristy, not the mainline places that people go as tourists, you might find out that there'll be less people speaking English than you think. So those are good places to start. But let's say you've been studying a little while, or you get that vocabulary down, where do you go next? Well, it's actually not as hard as you think. Because what I found was After I had mastered the greetings, well, I'm not going to say mastered, but after I felt confident or somewhat comfortable, let's put it that way, with some greetings, asking directions, ordering dinner, etc., then the conversations that I struck up with Italians while in Italy led to specific topics. What specific topics? Well, think about it. What you're going to speak about in Italy. What would you talk about other than history and the sites? But I mean, all the tourists are talking about that. If you wanted to have a genuine conversation with an Italian, if you really wanted to get to know them, by speaking Italian, what are you going to talk about? Well, what do you talk about here? What do you talk about in America or England or Australia or wherever you may be? In English, what do you talk about now? Because you're going to find that's what you're going to want to talk about when you're in Italy. For instance, for those of you that have full-time jobs, you talk about your work. Now you may say, well, I'm not going to want to talk about my work when I'm in Italy. Well, they're going to ask you what you do for a living, more than likely, and you're going to want to be able to convey that. You're probably going to want to talk about your family if you have family. Anything that you talk about now is probably what you're going to want to talk about then once you start to get to a semi-conversational level. And so I would encourage you to add to your vocabulary that you're learning, not to take the place of a structured course, but in addition to, or if you're not in a structured course, one way of gearing yourself to the vocabulary that you may end up finding yourself using in Italy is to learn those things, learn a vocabulary that have to do with the things that interest you here in America or wherever you may be. Because that's what you're going to want to talk about as they ask you questions about you. Also think about what you ask people about themselves. That would lend to more vocabulary. So these are the things that you're going to want to talk about. So now the good question is, these seem like obvious answers, right? They seem like, it seems like an obvious direction to go. But now when you sit down to write down your vocabulary list that you want to learn in Italian, it's very, very common for your mind to go blank. Okay, well, what do I talk about here? It's not like we keep track of that. And oftentimes it's something that, we just take for granted. We just talk. Excuse me, I don't record all of my conversations. And so I had to discover, what is it that I do talk about here? So this is my first tip for vocabulary. My first tip for determining what vocabulary I want to learn, what vocabulary I think I need. And that is to keep with you a small notepad. Now you can get the small ones with the spiral binding. I happen to travel a lot for work. This one's a little pad out of a motel. Something that you can put in your pocket, put in your purse, your briefcase, whatever's handy, whatever you have with you a lot. Post-it notes some people use even. That way they can use them later. We'll get into another tip. Why do you want one of these around? Because of back what I said earlier. Try say it in Italian. So if you're thinking about, especially if you're thinking about something that you want to say to someone, try to say that in Italian. If you don't know a word or two or three or whatever out of what it is that you want to communicate, then you simply write it down on this pad and you add it to a vocabulary list on a piece of paper or whatever, which we'll get to in a second. This becomes a source of discovery for you. That's why you want to have it with you at all times, if possible. Because it's those moments when you're by yourself, maybe you're driving your car. Now, I'm not encouraging you to write while you drive, but when you stop, pull into wherever you're going or whatever, you can write down what you're thinking about. But when you're driving in your car and you're thinking, try to vocalize that in Italian. And if there are a few words that you just don't know how to express, then when you get to where you're going, pull out your pad of paper and write down those words. Or maybe you're in the shower, and you're thinking about something in there. Try to vocalize that in Italian. If you find there are a few words you don't know when you get out, write them down. Anytime that you have some time where you're just thinking to yourself, try to say it in Italian. And whatever you can't say in Italian, write that down here, and that becomes your vocabulary list. Okay, so now you get your vocabulary list. What do you do with it? How do you study it? And that really boils down to your preference. But here's a couple of different tips. Personally, myself, I like writing down 2 columns on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And I simply slide one piece of paper a little bit down farther than the other, and I'll put my thumb over the right-hand side. I'll have English on the left, and I'll have Italian on the right. I'll slide it down until I see the first English word, and let's say it says tomato. Well, my thumb on the right-hand side is covering that. And I'll think to myself, how do I say tomato? Oh, pomodoro. And I'll move my thumb. What do you know? Pomodoro. I got it right. And so I put my thumb back over the top of the sheet that I'm sliding down over the second one, and I slide it down a little bit further, and it reveals my second English word. And then I review the Italian in that respect. Another method is index cards, which I think is good. A lot of people like the regular 3x5 index cards because you can write your words big. That way you don't have to have something small there. You can put English on one side and Italian on the other. And then they keep those index cards. They get a little box or whatever, and as they learn the vocabulary, they drop them in there, and they keep adding to it, and they periodically review. Another way are small cards about the size of business cards. A lot of people find those more convenient. The word isn't quite as big, but it's easy to keep with you at all times. So that when you have a few moments alone, a break, a lunch, whatever, anytime that you're alone and you want to work on that vocabulary, it's very handy for you to have. You can also get little carry around packs that are made for business cards or other memory cards of that sort that you can actually get and put them in, and they help keep them in order that way. But now a lot of people have told me, Chuck, I just can't memorize. It's something I just can't do. Well, I got to tell you that you can. It really isn't that difficult if you really, really break it down. For example, let's think of a word. It could be any word in Italian. Pomodoro, for instance, for tomato. Okay, if you can't remember that, say a syllable at a time. You look at tomato, turn it over, or look at your list, or however you have it set up, and you say pomodoro. Try to remember the first syllable. Po. Po. That's it. Can you remember po? Okay, so you look at the English word again, tomato, turn it over, pomodoro. Okay, first 2 syllables. Pomo. Pomo. So you go po, mo. Po, mo. And you just keep adding. Po, mo, do, ro. Pomodoro. It's facile. It's easy. So I just break it down. If you have trouble memorizing words at first, just break it down into syllables and remember a syllable at a time. And remember, you don't have to be in a hurry. Unless you set yourself some extreme goal, just keeping in mind that extreme goals require extreme measures. And I will tell you this, your brain in your synaptic pathways, well, your brain is a muscle, and your synaptic pathways work much the way muscles do. If you're learning how to dance or some type of athletic ability, you build memory muscles, or muscle memory, where you actually remember some things and you start doing them automatically, just like driving a car. How many of you that drive a car consciously get into that car and think, okay, check left-hand mirror, check right-hand mirror, check rear-view mirror, put key in ignition, turn? No, you don't think about those things. You do them automatically. It's second nature to you. And the same thing, it's because you've developed it, it's just becomes a pattern. Same thing with memorization. You're going to find the more vocabulary you work on, the easier it's going to become to get this vocabulary. But now keep in mind, and this is why we laid the foundation that we laid before we started getting into the nuts and bolts, it's important to have a basic understanding at least of pronunciation when you start working on your vocabulary, so that you don't start off saying the words really off base, which is why I recommended that you look for some type of pronunciation course or use the Otabalo course that's strictly on pronunciation. And you can find the link for that course right here. So I'd encourage you to do that. Now, the other thing about vocabulary is to use it, to practice it, to repeat it. Once you learn a word, you don't want to stop there. You want to review that word. Repetition is the key to long-term retention. In fact, I actually know some Italians that moved to America many, many years ago, and they actually have trouble speaking Italian now simply because they haven't used it. So when you're studying vocabulary, make sure you build yourself some type of a review routine. For instance, let's take the word pomodoro. Let's say you've worked on it for a day, you got it down pat. If you're using an index card or a list, it really doesn't matter what system you use to keep track of your vocabulary words. For sake of conversation, let's say you use a 3x5 index card. You buy boxes to put them in. And so pomodoro, you got down pat day 1. I would put it in a box that you use for weekly review. And I would daily review, and I would review that word daily, just once a day, find the time to pull that out. Tomato, oh, pomodoro, I knew that, okay? Put it back in the box. And review it daily at least for a week or 2. I would recommend 2 weeks. Actually, the best way to do it is to review it daily until it's second nature, to where it almost seems silly to review anymore. Then I would put it in a box that you review weekly. And I would review it weekly until you're so comfortable with it that you just don't feel like you need to review it anymore. But then the key is to find a place to practice your vocabulary, to find an outlet for practicing your vocabulary. Now, you don't have to practice every word you've learned every time you practice, but you should call on your vocabulary randomly. For instance, to be honest, I haven't said that word in I don't know how long, but I still have it, because I created a synaptic pathway to think about that and to express myself with it, and now I remember it. So where are some avenues in which you can use this? Well, the first is simply say it out loud. Make up sample conversations, talk to yourself. We'll talk about that more in another installment actually, but I do that all the time just so I can use the vocabulary that I've learned. But also think back to the last installment where we talked about support elements. It's a great opportunity to practice your vocabulary. Whether you physically find a group of people that you meet with and that you get together with and practice your Italian that way, try your vocabulary out there. If you meet at a restaurant, you're studying some words for food, try out your vocabulary with some of the people that are there that are also trying to learn Italian. For instance, mi piace i pomodori. I like tomatoes, if there happened to be a tomato there, or whatever. It doesn't matter what your vocabulary is. Try to find an outlet to use it. If you don't have a group of people that you get together with, I encourage you to find one if possible. Once again, referring back to the last installment. But if that's not possible, then try using it online. Whether you use Skype with an Italian, whether you have an Italian pen pal, or perhaps on the Otabalo Facebook page, or another English Italian language Facebook page, or the Facebook group. I was really happy to see we had a couple of new members in the Facebook group for Otabalo Italiano just this past week, and there was actually quite the discussion going for a little bit there. Bravo, guys, keep up the good work. But that's another great opportunity to use your vocabulary. Now you're writing it down, but that's actually even better to some degree. In fact, that reminds me, that's another thing. If you have a word that you're just having trouble remembering, then look at the English and write it down in Italian. Try to write it 10 times, 15, 20, whatever the case may be. One of the students that I actually tutored in person in Charleston, South Carolina, would fill up a notebook simply by writing down the vocabulary words over and over and over again, and she would say them to herself as she was writing them down, and her vocabulary grew by leaps and bounds. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if she spoke Italian better today than I do. So in review, okay, a couple things is, one we really didn't talk about other than I said don't be in a hurry, is remember incrementalism is the key, okay? So don't give yourself a vocabulary list of 2,000 words right off the bat, okay? Start with your list and add to it as you have the opportunity, but try to keep it somewhat reasonable so you don't overwhelm yourself. So number one, incrementalism. Number two, repetition. Very, very important for long-term memory. Okay, get yourself used to saying that word. Repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. And you might want to use paper. You might want to use cards, a couple of different sizes, Post-its. Oh, by the way, some people actually like using Post-its simply because they can take then the word that they put on there and they stick it to their refrigerator, they stick it to their wall, they stick it to their dashboard. Who knows? Although, once again, I'm not encouraging you to read while you're driving. Which reminds me, another avenue for learning vocabulary are podcasts. I'm sure that there are lots of podcasts available. If you can't find any available and you're looking for some, we also offer Il Tavolo Italiano podcast for vocabulary. And you can find the link right here. Now, these podcasts of vocabulary are actually set podcasts, which most, obviously all the ones you find out there are going to be set podcasts for a certain group of words. However, if you're interested in having a custom podcast made, a vocabulary that you want to learn, email me at iltavoloitaliano@gmail.com, and we're thinking about actually setting up a program where a podcast is actually custom tailored. Okay, so, and then use it or lose it is number 3. So you want to, talk to yourself, use some of the methods that we learned about when we were talking about support elements, and use it. And don't forget, for building your vocabulary, keep some kind of a notepad with you, something to scratch down a few words that you would like to learn in Italian. If you do these things, your vocabulary will build over time. And 3, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years from now, you'll be amazed at what you can say in Italian and what you can understand because your vocabulary is larger. So I hope that there was something in here for everyone. Some of these things obviously are going to be obvious to some of you. Some of you are probably already doing some of these things. Some of you might be brand new. But even for you seasoned Italian students that have been studying Italian for a while, I hope you picked up one small tidbit of information at least that you can apply to your routine for studying this beautiful language that will help you study it and help you learn Italian, So I hope you have a great day. Buona giornata. And I hope you continue to follow this series and join us for the next one, installment number 8, on working out the kinks in writing. Okay, so ciao. Grazie mille for studying with Il Tavolo Italiano. Remember, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or if you'd like to inquiry about tutoring or anything of that nature, you can reach me at iltavoloitaliano@gmail.com. Also, I would like to encourage you to subscribe to our video channel so you can be alerted automatically when the new videos come out. And you'll find the link to that at the bottom of the screen. Have a great day, e ricordate, parlate italiano. Ciao.